Barack Obama says one of his best foreign policy decisions was declining to attack Syria after that country's regime ignored a line in the sand that the American president had drawn. Much of the world thought America lost face over that decision, but Obama disagrees. Here to debate whether Obama's foreign policy is more feckless than forceful, we welcome back Stein and Studin. There's Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, and Irvin Studin, president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions and the publisher of Global Brief magazine, which is right here, available, as they say, Irvin, on better newsstands everywhere, something like that?
Some better, some worse.
Some better, some worse.
Thanks for having us.
Good to have you two back. Let's just start with what Barack Obama said once upon a time. He said, "We have been very clear to the Assad regime that a red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change my equation." Janice, Assad, in fact, did what the president warned him not to do. The consequences were nil. Was it the right decision?
No. That was, I think, one of his biggest mistakes, Steve. You do not draw a red line in the sand. That's how everybody describes this. And then when somebody crosses it, you stand back. And fundamentally, he devised an effective solution to get those chemical weapons out. But that doesn't really matter. People thought he was bluffing after that, and they certainly thought that way in the Middle East. However, he was feckless on this one case, but on the bigger picture of keeping the United States out of war in Syria, he got it absolutely right.
Hold off on the bigger picture for now. Irvin, on this one example with Syria, the line drawn in the sand and then ignored. The right or wrong approach?
Thanks for having us back and discussing this important topic. My late grandmother in Russian once said, "A nice person does not a professional make." And
how do you say that in Russian?
Хороший человек не профессия.
Beautiful.
It was more biting when she says it. It applies to Obama in foreign affairs in particular. I have a lot of regard for him as an intellectual, as an orator. However, in foreign affairs, he's been largely incompetent. However, where we'll disagree on this micro point of the red line, I'll take issue with Janice's point on whether it was wise. He was ill-advised to draw the red line. That is true. This is an American proclivity to deal with foreign affairs in set pieces. That is, there's a one-off transaction where either winners or losers, full stop, as opposed to a more kinetic game. That's an American weakness. Where he was wise, having seen the experience in Libya, was to backtrack and not let pride win the day. And as a result, Libya is in a terrible shape, but probably better off than where it had been had the Americans also intervened.
So, Janice, having drawn the red line and having watched Assad walk over that red line, what should the president have done?
Well, that's what's called entrapping yourself. And that's why you should be very careful. Before you issue a threat state, you have to say to yourself, what happens if it doesn't work? And then you're between a rock and a hard place. And that's really where Obama was. And it's interesting, the Russians helped him out, which we forget. Putin came to his rescue and devised a plan to get those chemical weapons out. But the damage was done because people like Assad then said, this man will bluff. He will not use force no matter what the provocation. And that led Assad to redouble his efforts to hang on and ultimately to invite the Russians in to up the ante and reverse some of the battlefield losses. So it's really a bad story. I'm not defending it. The bigger picture, though, was that there was no good military option for the United States in Syria.
So don't make the threat in the first place, then.
Don't make the threat in the first place, but having made one mistake, and here's the real challenge.
You don't make a second one.
Don't compound the mistake by making it worse and getting involved when you cannot succeed. Everybody says, by the way, the Russians proved this argument wrong. They went in, there was a military solution, they stabilized the battlefield. That argument is, frankly, nonsense. And why? They were working with the Syrian army. The United States had no such partner on the ground. And I think Obama got the big picture right there.
Irvin.
Well, Obama was, again, mistaken to have drawn the red line and wise to not dig himself an even bigger hole after having drawn that set play. But Janice, we need to go back a little bit further in history and say, before that, what happened? The biggest mistake of the Obama presidency, and one for which I think he should not be forgiven by history, and with which three major theaters are now dealing today is the Libyan intervention. Indeed, not the no-fly zones, but the idea to kill Gaddafi and remove the regime, and then
that was
withdraw.
A mistake, you say?
It was a criminal mistake, and in historical terms, it's something that will probably dictate the next 50 or 60 years of history.
You know who advised him to do that, eh? You know who advised him to do that?
Women.
Well, there were
Hillary Clinton,
Susan Rice.
Susan Rice, Samantha
Power. He's the president. He's the commander-in-chief. And he was moved by poor consideration. So when it came to the Syria theater, in drawing the red line, he said, I'm not going to repeat that. Moreover, I'm not going to cross swords with the Russians, where they do have a fundamental interest in Syria. It's their only base in the Middle East, and it's their only base, indeed, outside of the immediate Soviet theater. So I'm not only going to not compound the disaster in Syria, I'm going to avoid accidental or direct clashes with the Russians, as the Turks have done. So I applaud him for that. Otherwise, as we'll discuss, I think his presidency in foreign affairs terms, not domestic affairs terms, has been largely a disaster.
Again, before we get there, though, I still want to find out a little bit more about this Syrian situation. Assad clearly thinks Obama blinked.
Yep.
So he clearly has no more credibility as far as Assad is concerned. What about other world leaders, Irvin? Do you think Obama has lost credibility with other leaders around the world?
Well, this is part of the American foreign policy story. The aggregate story over the last 7-8 years is that America has, or the Obama presidency leaves 3 major global theaters in chaos. The Middle East, obviously, it's in worse chaos than it was during the Bush administration. The second theater is the Russia-Western theater. It's a needless clash that now will be difficult to remedy. And third is, paradoxically, Europe, which is suffering from the Middle East chaos. Now, Obama wasn't interested in Europe. He didn't touch Europe. And the flood of refugees is an Obama problem. It's not a Bush problem originally. Recall that Bush made the criminal mistake of having invaded Iraq. But there was no refugee problem in Europe at the time. That's because Iraq was surrounded largely by states. What Obama, under the Obama presidency, it's not only his fault. What happened is he supervised the erosion, the crumbling of Syria and Libya under his watch. And where did most of the refugees come from and come through? Those 2 theaters.
So I'm going to disagree entirely. And what's actually, Irvin, you're lacing your argument with what we call over-determinism. This is the fallacy that the United States...
He's smiling when you say that, Janice.
The United States
I don't even know what that means.
is responsible for everything that happens in the world. Europe's in trouble because refugees are bumping up against its border. Oh, gee, that's the United States that did that. The United States should have done something to prevent that.
No, it was Libya and Syria that did that,
well,
and Europe is suffering the cost,
The problem
obviously.
in Libya was a complicated problem. We had a guy there, Muammar Gaddafi, who is one of the most ruthless, brutal guys. And, you know, this was a really tough situation. His trucks were driving down the road. There would probably have been a slaughter of about 100,000 people. And if everybody had stood by, they could have bombed his trucks and stopped. That's true. Well, we still would have had chaos. We still would have had an independent Benghazi that would have eventually led to a fight with Tripoli.
So you can't hang that on Obama, you don't believe?
You can't really hang it on Obama in a deep sense. Here's the bigger picture. The Middle East is imploding, largely as a result of problems inside the Middle East. And all the United States can do, frankly, is stand back, have the fire engines circling the field, hope to put out as many fires as it can when they try to spread out the region, but say to the Middle East, you guys have to fix this.
But
he got
Janice
that right.
Janice just said that we're being over-deterministic, if I use the right adjective to her noun. But we were talking about the red line in Syria. Obama understood the limits of American power, and indeed what I would argue is a lack of American knowledge in Syria, where he didn't in Libya. America was very active, not only in drawing the no-fly zones, which is laudable because there was a potential genocide. We're an R2P country, fair enough. There was no need to push the regime to an end. That's what we did in Iraq, the Western world, apart from Canada, we were more modest. Libya was left in chaos. We retreated. In retrospect, he paints a narrative of it having been the right thing to do, which is the equivalent of Janice saying,
no.
wait, Gaddafi was a monster, he's a terrible human being, and that stands on its own. No, what stands on its own is the aggregate ledger. Are there more body bags as a result of his removal than there would have been had he been in power?
What's
and the
answer?
answer is, of course, yes. Not only that, but the biggest peace project of the last 50, 60 years, Europe, is on its knees because of that chaos,
Well,
with no resolution in sight.
Very quickly on this one, Libya was imploding. The United States pushed it along. If the United States had done nothing, and all out civil war was going to break out once the situation had reached the point where Gaddafi was going to go after his own civilians in a massive way. So that civil war was unavoidable. Once you get a civil war raging in Syria and in Libya and in Yemen, and that has nothing to do with the United States, the civil war, or not very much.
In Yemen.
Nothing to do with the removal of Gaddafi. The signal that it sent to opposition regimes or opposition force across the Middle East.
No, these have to do with very brittle regimes in this part of the world, and we reached a moment in history where those brittle regimes are cracking apart, and these refugee flows that we've seen coming north from the Mediterranean and west from Syria, they were simply
So
waiting.
there's going to be a lot of body bags anyways.
This
There were going to be a lot of body
This is a bit
bags
of the Tony
happening
Blair
anyway.
argument for rationalizing Iraq. Said at one point Iraq would have fallen anyway, so we just helped push it over. And if I go back to other interviews we've done in your terrific show, Steve, I've done a calculation on how long modern states have lasted over the last 60 years. The answer is about 60 years on average. Canada's 150. We're exceptional. The Middle East is around that sweet spot. Wait. The Soviet Union lasted 70 years. Yeah. So on that logic, we're looking at fragile regimes. Let's just help push them over, irrespective of consequence, and then call it a day. Call it the right thing.
Nope.
Here's
What
a problem with
Yugoslavia?
Hold on. Here's a problem with the American logic under Obama. I fear it's a bit of a Western hubris, is the idea that we can be educated in top universities in the Ivy League, not speak any foreign languages, have a team that has lived 0 years abroad, and then go into foreign theaters and intervene in the name of an ideology, retreat, and then call it a day, call it a thing well done.
We mean well, though, Irvin.
Well, we mean well.
But
We
you
mean
see-
well, but as my grandmother said, meaning well is not a professional
But
criterion,
here's-
particularly in international
But
affairs.
here's the irony. Obama is being criticized as feckless, Steve, not because he did too much, as Irvin's saying, but because he did too little. Most of the criticism that comes from the broad middle of the United States, that
With
comes
whom are
from
you
the
speaking? With
well,
whom are you
that comes
speaking?
from the Clinton campaign, that comes from pretty well the center to the right in this country, is Obama failed to lead, failed to do too much, sat back, and at the very most led from behind. So paradoxically, he's being criticized for doing too little.
But
and
again,
Irvin's saying
on
he's doing
Syria,
too
though,
much.
on Syria, though, again, having made the threat that if they did anything
was a
with chemical
mistake.
weapons, okay, you both agreed that it was a
Right.
mistake to make it. Having made it, though,
Don't compound it.
no, he couldn't very well then put troops on the ground in Syria and say we're going to bring this thing to an end.
No, but nobody could. In other words, if Hillary Clinton, let's argue it this way: if the presidential election was 2 years ago, and Hillary Clinton had been elected, and she's a hawk on Syria, she could not have put U.S. troops on the ground and ended it, because U.S. troops cannot end that war.
Okay, let's in our remaining
Just
moments here.
One quick point.
One quick, okay.
Janice, one of the things I admire of Janice is she's one of the pioneers of Canadian foreign policy. One of our key weaknesses is that we keep quoting American authorities. Indeed, there's almost what I call the Globe and Mail, New York Times, the Economist axis. We all talk to one another, and then Janice says, well, everyone's saying Obama's not done enough. Well, go a little bit outside of that Anglo-American circle, and you'll find that Obama is seen, yes, as weak in Asia, but Asia's a neutral theater in terms of his ultimate performance. But disastrous where he's actually tried to be activist. That is, we assigned some sort of morality play to Middle East theaters where there was absolute chaos and monsters were against monsters. We call it a day, we left it in chaos, and then we're talking to ourselves again.
Well, let's do
mistake
this.
after mistake.
In our remaining moments, then, okay, the Mideast is worse off. The Russian relationship is worse off.
Not because of Obama.
Okay, well, let's just say that it is. The European situation is worse off today than it was 7 years ago when he became president. Where has he had a positive impact on the world?
Well, let me make a strong case
Okay.
that the agreement that he concluded with Iran, the nuclear agreement, was very much a function of the Obama-Kerry administration. There were strong odds against success in concluding that agreement. There's no question that that agreement avoided an escalation to war, if not immediately, soon. And he has bought everybody 10 to 15 years in order to see how this problem evolves. And he's been very careful about what he's promised, Steve. He has not said that the Iranians will not move toward weaponization at some point, and he's not promised that they won't cheat.
But he's bought time.
But he's bought time, and he's bought intrusive verification.
Let me find
that
it
is serious.
Do you agree that the Iran deal belongs on the list of achievements?
I agree, absolutely. It was not a masterstroke, it was a major achievement, and against the odds, against probability, against a lot of pressure. Here's the issue. In respect of Iran, just as happened in other parts of the Middle East, we in the West, and particularly the Obama administration, and surely the one afterwards, are in danger of what we've historically been susceptible to playing, that is the role of, forgive my expression, useful idiots. That is, we come in and we think we've done something, and the local parties who know their space very well, just as we in Canada know our space much better when a foreigner comes, nod their head in agreement and play the narrative that we want to hear. Just as Hillary Clinton said in the Atlantic piece, I was sold a bill of goods on Libya. I wanted to believe. The same thing happened in a lot of the revolutions related to Russia, dare I say. We're not touching that here, in relation to Syria. And in the Iran thing, it's not only a deal, a one-off deal. This is one of our weaknesses. We tend to see it as a one-off deal. We moved on. That's the transaction. The Iranians are playing a kinetic game. That's just one piece in their pie in terms of strategy.
Okay.
So we're naive to see it as just one transaction.
Let's look at the bigger puzzle then. In our last minute here, 30 seconds to each of you, is there, in his remaining 8 or 9 months in office, one more foreign policy achievement that is out there and close?
He's hoping, I think, that the session of Congress that will return to Washington after the election will pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will be a signature piece for him. Which is not only a trade agreement, Steve, in his view, but it's a major foreign policy play to reshape the architecture.
Okay.
Because
TPP.
China's out of it, not in it. And that's his attempt really to reassure much of Southeast Asia, the United States is there to stay.
The TPP won't have historical legs beyond 5 or 6 years because the Chinese are closing in, have a bigger deal, and then eventually they'll merge the two.
So what's his last big achievement?
I think the major goal, and there could be a major terrorist attack before he's out of office, so that's one thing. The second major thing that he needs to worry about is the future of Europe, is to defend against it, right? But the future of Europe could be determined even in his remaining time. Well, I'm calling for a Europe 2.0, which bridges Moscow, Kiev, and Brussels into a new framework that starts to deal with some of the existential pressures on Europe. And Obama is a key player to bridge those solitudes.
To be continued. Thank you, Stein and Studin, for another edition.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.